Hello everyone! In case you're wondering what that intro was all about, I've basically got my hands on two LG 65-inch B7 OLED for a side-by-side comparison of Dolby Vision versus HDR10. But unfortunately, one of the TVs didn't come with the metal plate that connects the OLED panel to the crescent stand. So I had to do some last-minute improvisation and basically prop the TV up against the wall, cushioned against a styrofoam board that was included inside the box, so that the screen itself is tilted slightly backwards and its base is sitting flush on top of a flat surface on my AV rack, sort of like the Sony A1. And to stop the screen from sliding forwards, I've had to put a relatively heavy Samsung K950 soundbar in front of the LG B7, which must rank as the closest encounter between these two South Korean arch rivals ever since I introduced a new LG PR to a Samsung engineer at the What Hi-Fi Awards one year, and they shook hands. Hello everyone, my name is Vincent Teo and I'm a TV reviewer and professional calibrator. In this video, we're going to do a side-by-side comparison of Dolby Vision versus HDR10 from an Ultra HD Blu-ray. Now, there are already a number of YouTube videos comparing Dolby Vision versus HDR10. These are the two most popular formats, HDR formats on the market. Dolby Vision is proprietary, whereas HDR10 is open standard. Dolby Vision uses dynamic metadata, whereas HDR10 uses static metadata. So we're going to do a side-by-side comparison today. But as I said, there are already many YouTube videos online comparing these two formats. And so far, from what I've seen, either they have actually been using a 2016 OLED, let's say an LG C6 versus the LG B6 for the side-by-side comparison. In my opinion, that is not really a fair comparison because we know that the 2016 LG OLEDs suffer from less than optimal tone mapping for HDR10 content, so specular highlight detail may get clipped. Also, they have less than optimal above black handling, so in my opinion that is not really a fair comparison. If you are using the 2016 OLEDs, the Dolby Vision is obviously going to look much better. And there are other comparison videos that are using an OLED on one side for Dolby Vision and an LED LCD on the other side for HDR10. For example, let's say they were using the LG B6 for the Dolby Vision and Samsung LED LCD or Sony LED LCD for the HDR10 comparison. Again, I don't think it's a fair comparison because if you're seeing any difference, you don't know whether that difference is caused by Dolby Vision versus HDR10 or is caused by the fundamental display technology differences between OLED, which is self-emissive, and LED LCD, which is transmissive and needs a backlight to generate a picture. There are also other comparisons that only use one screen, let's say the LG 2017 OLED C7 or the 2016 OLED B6, that compares basically what they're doing is that they're feeding a Dolby Vision source to one HDMI port, HDR10 source to another HDMI port, and then they toggle back and forth to try and see the difference. Although this is probably novel, I think for the most apparent differences, it is very, very difficult for us to make a judgment based on one screen because there's always a delay between switching HDMI inputs, and also our memory is quite fleeting. We don't know whether we're actually seeing the difference or not. You can use your camera to try and capture the difference between, let's say, Dolby Vision and HDR10 on the same screen. But because of most cameras' limited dynamic range, whereas we are trying to capture differences in high dynamic range, which is significantly greater than the dynamic range of the camera, the differences may not be readily visible if you judge it from a photo alone. So, although the intention is good, comparing on the same screen for Dolby Vision versus HDR10 has its own flaws. So today what I'm going to do is to compare Dolby Vision versus HDR10 using two LG 65-inch B7 OLED that I've been fortunate enough to get in this room today. So from the crescent stand, this is the European version, the UK and European version of LG B7, and as I mentioned before, the other set is also an LG B7, but it is propped up because the metal plate that was connecting the OLED panel to the crescent stand was missing. But I'll go ahead and show you that this is actually indeed an LG B7, just to reassure you that I'm not actually cheating in any way. So if I actually click about this television, and then you can see that this is the OLED 65B7V, which is the UK version of B7. Okay, so we are using two LG B7, which is the 2017 OLED television from LG Electronics, and it just so happens that this is the same TV that actually won the Best HDR category in our annual TV shootout recently. So the strength of LG's 2017 OLEDs versus, let's say, competing OLEDs from Panasonic and Sony for the year 2017 is that the LG models generally have a lower automatic brightness limiter, which means that brighter images generally will look brighter on the LG 2017 OLEDs. And also they have this technology called the active HDR technology. What it actually does is some sort of dynamic tone mapping. So it tries to generate dynamic metadata from the static metadata that is present in the Ultra HD Blu-rays or any HDR10 source, in fact, by analyzing the incoming histogram and then applying the appropriate tone curve to try and optimize the picture. Now let's get to the sources then. So the screen on the left is the one that is going to be displaying Dolby Vision, and the screen here on your right is going to be the one that is displaying HDR10. And to feed Dolby Vision content to the LG B7 on your left there, I'm using an OPPO 203, which is playing a Dolby Vision Ultra HD Blu-ray, and there are 3 titles. I'll go through the 3 titles later on. So it's an OPPO 203 feeding Dolby Vision Ultra HD Blu-ray to the LG B7, and on this one I'm using a Panasonic UB900 to feed HDR10 Ultra HD Blu-ray to this LG B7 as well. Now in an ideal world, I would probably try and get my hands on 2 OPPO 203s for this comparison. So one OPPO 203 will be sending Dolby Vision and the other OPPO 203 will be sending HDR10. But for some reason, I'm not that popular with OPPO's PR company in the UK. I really don't know why. That's despite me doing a good video explaining the numerous settings in the OPPO 203, using the OPPO 203 in most of my TV reviews and also in our TV shootout. So I'm just not sure why I'm not that popular with them. The reason just escapes me at the moment. So yes, OPPO 203 Dolby Vision to one screen, Panasonic UB900 HDR10 to another screen. Like I said, in an ideal world, I would be using 2 OPPO 203. But what I've actually done is to compare the HDR10 output of the OPPO 203 versus the HDR10 output on the Panasonic UB900 on both screens, and they look very, very similar to my eyes after calibration. So I'm satisfied that this is a fair Dolby Vision versus HDR10 comparison on the same display technology, on the same television model. And I'm using 4K Blu-ray, by the way, because it is physical media, it is repeatable. Unlike streaming, it is subject to less compression and less bandwidth limitations depending on your broadband and things like that. Also, it's probably easier for me to actually try and pause a certain section and analyze it without the menu actually coming up and obscuring the screen and things like that. So I'm using 4K Blu-ray rather than any streaming, let's say from Netflix 4K or Amazon Prime Video, to do this Dolby Vision versus HDR10 comparison. Right. Is there anything else that I need to tell you? Okay, so both of these LG B7 has been calibrated in their respective Dolby Vision and HDR10 modes, and as part of the comparison, I have been switching the sources around here and there, and I'm satisfied that both screens are performing to their optimum capability for this comparison. So there are 2 Ultra HD Blu-ray players here for this comparison, the OPPO 203 and the Panasonic UB900. So I will need 2 copies of each 4K Blu-ray titles for this demonstration or comparison. So I've purchased 2 copies of Despicable Me 2, which is available in Dolby Vision with a base HDR10 layer. And I've also purchased 2 copies of The Fate of the Furious, which is available in Dolby Vision with a HDR10 base layer. And also 2 copies of Power Rangers. And I must be the only person in this world who has actually purchased 2 copies of Power Rangers. And my fear, my perennial fear, is that I will forever be remembered as the person who thought that Power Rangers was a movie so good that I bought it twice. But that's the sacrifice I have to make for this comparison for the benefit of the AV enthusiast community. So without further ado, let's get on with the comparison. I'm going to start off with Despicable Me 2. Okay, here I'm using a very early scene from the 4K Blu-ray of Despicable Me 2. The screen on your left is showing it in Dolby Vision. You can see that it's actually in Dolby Vision, whereas the screen on the right here is showing it in HDR10. Right, so what we want to pay attention to is the blue sky, and usually a tonally uniform background in animated films tend to show up the polarization artifact or banding that is inherent in the source. And if you pay attention to this area here, I don't know whether you can actually see it from the camera, but according to my eyes, what I can see is that the Dolby Vision version showed slightly less polarization. So the gradation is slightly smoother in this blue sky here compared with the HDR10 version on the right here. And what I'm going to do now is to try and force the OPPO 203 to output HDR10 rather than Dolby Vision, and then I'll compare again. Okay, so I forced the OPPO 203 to output HDR10 rather than Dolby Vision on the LG B7 on the left here, and you can see that it's outputting in HDR10, and the screen on the right is outputting HDR10 as well. So if you pay attention to this area here, again, I don't know whether you can actually see the difference from the camera, but to my eyes, both HDR10 version have the similar amount of polarization or banding, so the gradation is slightly stepped in this tonally uniform area. Now let me switch back to Dolby Vision again on the screen on the left. Alright, I've switched the screen on the left here back to Dolby Vision, as you can see here. And again, paying attention to this area here and this area here. Again, I can see that the Dolby Vision version has less polarization, which means that the gradation is slightly smoother. Now, the reason for this improvement, I think, is because of 12-bit versus 10-bit. So let me pull up the playback info of the source disk. So if you long press the info button on the OPPO 203, you can see that the original color space is in Dolby Vision 12-bit. But if I pull up the playback info on the HDR10 version using the Panasonic UB900, you can see that I'll use the cursor, which comes in very handy, this magic cursor. You can see that it is originally in 10-bit, whereas on the Dolby Vision version, it is actually in 12-bit. So some people say that the current Dolby Vision content that we're getting is fake Dolby Vision, in that in fact, all of the consumer televisions these days are at most 10-bit or maybe even less. So how can you actually get 12-bit into 10-bit and get a better gradation? But as we can actually see here, you actually can. And the analogy that I'm going to use is, because I've been shooting more videos recently, as you may have noticed, the analogy I'm going to use is that, let's say if you actually shoot a footage using a 4K camera and then downsample it to a 1080p resolution, it is still going to look sharper and cleaner than a footage that's been shot in just pure 1080p. So a 4K downsample to 1080p footage is going to look better than a footage that is just shot in 1080p. It's going to look sharper, it's going to look cleaner. And I think this is the phenomenon that is happening on 12-bit versus 10-bit. So the 12-bit is actually in the source from the Dolby Vision. When the base HDR10 layer is combined with the Dolby Vision enhancement layer, the final signal is actually in 12-bit. So there are actually 2 extra bits than just the HDR10 version. The number 10 in HDR10 actually means 10-bit. So the base layer is only 10-bit, whereas with the Dolby Vision signal, you are getting 12-bit of data. And when you downsample 12-bit to a 10-bit panel, the result actually looks smoother than what you're actually getting from a 10-bit source that is actually displayed on a 10-bit panel. And that is the first takeaway from this Dolby Vision versus HDR10 comparison. Next is a scene where the camera focus is on this gentleman here with a red silk shirt. Now what I can say is that the Dolby Vision version, that's on the left here, by the way, I'll just show you that it's still in Dolby Vision. The Dolby Vision version, the red shirt, and this general color palette looks more saturated and richer than the HDR10 version. And this is the HDR10 version on the right here. I'll just show you, right? So HDR BT 2020. So the Dolby Vision version, the color palette looks richer and more saturated than the HDR10 version. And sometimes I have to ask myself, what is the cause of this? So I went into the menu, and in the Dolby Vision version, you can see that the color gamut is actually fixed to white, whereas with the HDR10 version, if I go into the menu on the right here, with HDR10 version, the color gamut is auto, which is correct. This is actually the correct setting for HDR10 on the 2017 LG OLED. Now, if we actually push it to white, what it does is that it just pushes the colors over the top. Even the face now starts looking jaundiced. Extender is slightly better, but it's still not quite, in terms of the flash tone, if you can call this flash tone, it's still not quite as natural as the one on the Dolby Vision version. And you get this really overblown red on the shirt now. So auto is the correct setting. And even if you push it to extended or wide, it still doesn't come close to matching the color vibrance yet naturalness of the Dolby Vision version. Another thing is just how the luminosity, or how should I put it, the transfer function of Dolby Vision actually looks. If you actually pay attention to the whole picture, the Dolby Vision version has slightly more depth, and in the SDR terms, this can be explained by gamma. This has a slightly higher gamma, whereas the HDR10 version looks slightly overexposed in photography terms. If you pay attention to the screen on the left here, where my magic cursor is, the nose here is more distinct against the face compared with the HDR10 version, where the outline of his nose actually almost blends into his face. And that is a function of gamma in SDR terms, or electro-optical transfer function, where I think the Dolby Vision version can optimize it better for this scene, whereas the HDR10 version is depending on static metadata that covers the entire spectrum. And can the fact that the HDR10 picture looks slightly overexposed be explained by dynamic contrast? I tried switching dynamic contrast off. By the way, on 2017 LG OLEDs, dynamic contrast actually activates this feature called active HDR, or dynamic tone mapping, on the 2017 LG OLEDs. So if I switch it off, what happens is that you don't get any increase in vibrance or depth of the picture. It just becomes slightly dimmer on the scene. But the correct setting on the 2017 LG OLED is to engage active HDR on the low setting, and you can see that it matches the Dolby Vision version. In fact, it's probably slightly brighter, but it has this overexposed look compared with the increased depth and pop that you actually get on the Dolby Vision version. Okay, for the next comparison in Despicable Me 2, the 4K Blu-ray version, I'm using this fairly busy scene to illustrate some differences here. And again, the HDR10 version on the LG B7, I'll show you that on the right here is still in HDR10. It looks slightly more washed out than the Dolby Vision version, which is you can see here is Dolby Vision, which is on the left here. So again, I get this overexposed, washed out look on the HDR10 version compared with the Dolby Vision version. If you pay attention to, let's say, this area here on the right here, the blacks are slightly brighter and grayer than the darkness of this area here, just under the roof here. And as a direct result of this, I think what is actually happening is that the picture on the left here, which is the Dolby Vision rendition, actually has more depth and dimensionality, and as a direct result, it actually looks sharper as well. If you pay attention to, let's say, these leaves here and also the grass on the ground here, I can make out probably more individual leaves and more grass on the ground than the HDR10 version on my right here. And the reason is because I think the Dolby Vision version has actually optimized the contrast, especially in terms of gamma. To me, in SDR terms, I'm using SDR because it's what I was used to, but in traditional terms, in analogy terms, the screen on the left might be gamma 2.4, whereas the screen on the right here, which is the HDR10 version, might be gamma 2.2. And as a result, you get this really washed out look on the right here. And to me, the one on the left not only has more depth and dimensionality, the detail in the individual objects also seem to sharpen up. And the reason is because a higher contrast actually increased the perceived sharpness of the image. If you can imagine black text on a white paper versus black text on a gray paper, the one on the white paper will look sharper. And the same principle is being applied to this Dolby Vision version because of its optimized gamma or electro-optical transfer function for this particular scene. You can actually make out more crispness or sharpness in terms of the detailing of the leaves here and also the grass in the ground here compared with the HDR10 version. Let's move on to a non-animated film then. This is Power Rangers, which I'm displaying on the two LG B7 that I have here, and on the left it is the Dolby Vision version, and on the right it is the HDR10 version. So I have to purchase 2 copies of Power Rangers for the purpose of this comparison. So this is a movie that is so good, I bought it twice. Again, displaying this bright scene here that is filmed in daylight. And I always like to use a daylight scene for comparison because it is closest to the D65 industry standard of white point. Now, again, what I can see here is that the tone curve on the Dolby Vision version gives the whole image that sort of depth. On the HDR10 version on the right here, even though standalone, it probably looks excellent, but compared with the Dolby Vision version, it has a slight loss of depth. It looks more overexposed, it looks more washed out. And as a result of this better optimized tone curve, sort of like a 2.4 gamma kind of thingy on the Dolby Vision version. So I'll just point out the things on the Dolby Vision version that looks better to my eyes. So the skin tones look richer, but yet still quite natural. The rocks and also the leaves, every detailing, it looks sharper because of this optimized contrast. And although there's less shadow detail on the sweater here compared with the HDR10 version and slightly less detail on the hairs compared with the HDR10 version, I mean, not all shadow detail are meant to be fully visible anyway. The more shadow detail that you expose, the more washed out the picture will be, hence the concept of 2.4 versus 2.2 gamma. To my eyes, I like how the shadows actually fall on the faces. Let's say on this guy's face, the sunlight hits from this angle here, and then the shadows fall very naturally under his eyes and around his cheeks. Whereas on the HDR10 version, I think that the shadows are slightly too bright, in the sense that this may be a 2.2 gamma that is more suitable for a daytime viewing. I'm just using the SDR analogous terms to explain because it is the simplest way for me to explain. So I hope that you bear with me that I'm not using the correct term for HDR explanation. But to me, the whole picture looks richer and slightly sharper on the Dolby Vision version. One issue with the Dolby Vision version when displayed on the LG OLED, I don't know whether the same applies to other Dolby Vision sets outside the UK, such as the Vizios and the TCLs, is that on this particular scene here, where it's fairly dark with just the Power Rangers title here, the black bars, the top and bottom letterbox bars, are actually fairly gray, and it's certainly not inky black, unlike the HDR10 version. I've put up a still photo which is low ISO because I need to overexpose it to show the difference, but I can see that the Dolby Vision version is actually brighter. The blacks are not black, it's slightly shallower, and this applies to the top and bottom letterbox bars as well. And if you stand up close to the screen, you can actually see slightly wavy fine lines going up the screen, which is fairly strange. But with proper adjustment of the settings, certainly this is not an issue, and I don't think that it necessarily will crush the shadow details as well. This scene has such a high dynamic range that it is going to be very difficult for my camera that has a limited dynamic range to show you what I'm actually seeing in person, but at least I'll talk you through it if you can pay attention to the magic cursor. So if you pay attention to the screen on the left here, I'll show you that this is the Dolby Vision version, and the screen on the right here is the HDR10 version. And what we can see here is that there's a very bright headlamp in the center of the forehead of this dude here against a fairly dark background. What I can see from where I'm sitting is that the blacks behind this guy here is shallower than the blacks on the Dolby Vision version. Now, of course, part of the reason is because we have actually engaged dynamic contrast or active HDR or dynamic tone mapping on the HDR10 version. So if we go in there and switch it off, then what you can see now is that yes, the blacks do become inkier, similar to the Dolby Vision version on the left here. But because of trying to tone map this bright light here and trying to maintain the deep blacks, you can see that his shirt has actually lost its necessary luminance to become as bright as the Dolby Vision version here. So to get the shirt to match the brightness of the shirt on the Dolby Vision version, you have to engage dynamic contrast or active HDR to brighten things up, but as a direct result, the blacks do wash out as well. So this is the compromise that all TVs with static metadata has to contend with, whereas the Dolby Vision version, because it is actually optimizing the tone curve for this particular scene or even this particular frame, you get the luminosity of this bright headlamp here very nicely, and you maintain the brightness level of the shirt here, yet you maintain the inkiness of the blacks in the background, which gives a realistic, rich, yet natural looking picture versus the HDR10 or static metadata version. Interestingly, one of the most drastic differences we noticed between the Dolby Vision version and the HDR10 version of the Power Rangers is in the end credits, where there's white text against a black background. If you can see from the camera here, hopefully it can depict it correctly. The screen on the left here is showing the Dolby Vision version, and the text is just so much brighter and luminous than the HDR10 version here. I'll show you that the screen on the right here is showing the HDR10 version. And the reason I think is because Power Rangers is a disc that is actually mastered to 4000 nits. Again, later when I actually swap the OPPO 203 to HDR10 to compare side by side, I'll show you the metadata. But this is a disc that is actually mastered to 4000 nits. And as we know, the 2017 LG OLED has very aggressive tone mapping that tries to retain all specular highlight detail. So upon detection of a 4000 nit data, what the LG 2017 OLED will do is to lower the general APL to try and retain the specular highlight detail. And I think that's what is actually happening here on this particular disc from Lionsgate with the mastering display luminance or MDL of 4000 nits. If I actually switch the picture mode to other settings that I've calibrated in sort of a way, Vivid is brighter, but it's still not going to be as bright as the Dolby Vision version. Standard is dimmer, and cinema mode is dim as well. So I think it is because of the tone mapping, the very, very aggressive tone mapping that LG is using on their 2017 OLEDs that is causing this to happen on the HDR10 version. Whereas with the Dolby Vision version on the left here, because it has an enhanced Dolby Vision layer that tells the screen that this white text here should be at this level, it actually managed to brighten up while maintaining the inky black. And that's the beauty of dynamic metadata. You can actually optimize it for each scene or even each frame. Now what I'm going to do now is to switch the OPPO 203 to force HDR10, and then we'll compare the luminance of this text side by side against each other on basically the same screen. Okay, I forced the OPPO 203 to output HDR10 to the screen on your left here, and you can see that it's HDR10 BT 2020, and on the right here is the same as well. Okay, and you can see that the brightness or luminance of the text on the screen and the blackness of the background is essentially identical on both sets now, which means that the Dolby Vision version is much brighter because of dynamic metadata. And I'll go in and show you the metadata on this HDR10 version. If we long press the info button on the OPPO 203, we scroll down, and here I love this magic cursor. So the maximum luminance of this title is 4000 nits. And as a direct result, the LG 2017 OLED is trying to tone map fairly aggressively to maintain all the specular highlight detail, which is why you get this dimness here that you're actually seeing on screen on the static metadata or HDR10 version. But in the Dolby Vision version earlier, as you can see, the brightness is restored for this scene because there is additional dynamic metadata for this particular scene that tells the TV to output it to that sort of brightness. Okay, moving on to our last Ultra HD Blu-ray title that we're going to do this Dolby Vision versus HDR10 comparison. It is the Fate of the Furious, and the screen on the left, as usual, is showing it in Dolby Vision, and the screen on the right here is showing it in HDR10. Okay, so the difference on this title is probably a bit more subtle than the differences we saw with Despicable Me 2 and also Power Rangers, but still I can probably make out slightly more pop and depth to the Dolby Vision version, in the sense that because of more optimized tone curve, the leaves look slightly more detailed in the background to my eyes, and the palette is slightly richer as well. But you can say that the richness of the palette can be to detriment later on in this film, as I'll show you in the next scene. The increased saturation that is brought by the Dolby Vision presentation can work against the film as well, as you can probably see in the scene here where the rock look more suntanned and ruddy on the Dolby Vision version on the left here. Right, so this is the Dolby Vision version versus the HDR10 version on the right here, where the lighter gamma actually serves to reduce the oversaturation of the skin tones in this particular movie. Now, obviously, I don't know how this particular movie, Fate of the Furious, was graded, but I think what the colorist probably went for is the very commonly used in Hollywood blockbusters orange and teal effect, which makes everyone look quite orangey, quite suntan. Many characters in this film, they look like they are walking around with permanent suntan. And I can see why certain parties would prefer the lighter shade, the lighter saturation on the HDR10 version, but that is not necessarily correct. But that may be more pleasing to the eyes because the skin tones look less ruddy or less tan than the presentation of the Dolby Vision version on your left here. So we have compared quite a number of scenes from 3 Ultra HD Blu-ray titles on the same television, which is the LG B7 OLED TV. And there are a few improvements that Dolby Vision has brought to the table. The first one is actually in terms of a smoother gradation, because Dolby Vision, the source itself is 12-bit, and therefore even though these TVs are 10-bit panel, it just seems to resolve the gradation in a finer manner, slightly finer. It's not night and day, but if you look for it, especially in a tonally uniform background such as blue skies in animation movies, then you will be able to spot the improvement. Whereas on the HDR10 base layer, it is only 10-bit HDR10. The 10 actually means that it's 10-bit, so there will be more posterization or bending artifacts. Again, I stress that this is not night and day, but the improvement is there on the Dolby Vision version, because once the HDR10 base layer is reassembled with the Dolby Vision enhancement layer, the data is 12-bit, and so even though these displays are 10-bit, the gradation just looks finer on the Dolby Vision version. That's the improvement number one. Improvement number two is just a general increase in pop and depth and dimensionality of the Dolby Vision image. And the reason I think is because of the optimized tone curve that is derived from the dynamic metadata. So dynamic metadata can actually specify the light level and the illumination and the tone curve for a particular scene, whereas with static metadata, you apply the same tone curve throughout all the scenes. And even though LG's 2017 OLEDs are an innovative product in the sense that they try to actually generate their own tone curve from static metadata, it still didn't come close to matching the dynamic metadata that Dolby Vision has brought to the party. So I'm seeing an improvement in terms of the pop and depth of the image. In SDR analogy, it is like seeing 2.4 gamma versus 2.2 gamma. So standalone, the HDR10 version looked excellent because of OLED self-emissive capabilities, true black vibrant colors. But when you compare it side by side against the Dolby Vision version, it just looks flatter. The HDR10 version just looks flatter and more washed out than the Dolby Vision presentation, which has more depth and dimensionality to the entire image. Again, I'm using gamma to try and describe this because I think it's easier for most people to understand rather than using the correct technical term of EOTF or electro-optical transfer function. But because of the improve or optimize tone curve or electro-optical transfer function on the Dolby Vision rendition, it actually affects the colors as well and the detail as well. The colors just look richer, more vibrant, more saturated, whereas this HDR10 version, again, I stress that standalone, if you don't compare it side by side, you probably will think that the HDR10 rendition is excellent, and that's what I've thought so far. But after doing the side-by-side comparison, the Dolby Vision version just looks more saturated, more vibrant, richer, with more depth and refinement to the entire image. And here's the thing, how much of an improvement this is. We all know that in theory, dynamic metadata will be superior to static metadata just by virtue of scene by scene or even frame by frame optimization that dynamic metadata provides. But how much of an improvement can I actually see? The thing is, after seeing it on these two LG OLEDs, I would overwhelmingly prefer to watch Dolby Vision over HDR10 because of this improved depth, improved color saturation, improved richness of the entire image. And because the tone curve is optimized, even the detail looks slightly sharper on the Dolby Vision version as well. I've explained this to you earlier, but the reason is because a higher contrast actually increases the perceived sharpness of the image. If you can imagine black text on a white paper versus black text on a gray paper, the one on the white paper will look sharper to our eyes. And that's what is happening with the Dolby Vision version, because it can actually optimize the tone curve and the colors and contrast within the same image. Even though the detail is actually not increased, it just subjectively looks sharper to my eyes. And here's the thing, someone somewhere will probably ask me how much of an improvement dynamic metadata or Dolby Vision is over the HDR10 version. It's difficult for me to place a number, but what I will say is this. What is seen cannot be unseen. What is known cannot be unknown. And now that I've done this thorough side-by-side comparison of Dolby Vision versus HDR10 using not only an animated movie but also two live-action movies, side by side, both calibrated to their best capability, I would prefer to watch Dolby Vision any time of the day over the HDR10 version. And I think dynamic metadata certainly has so much superiority to the static metadata that HDR10 actually offers. And also don't forget about my earlier point about the 12-bit versus 10-bit in the source as well. Even though these TVs are all only 10-bit, if you have a pristine 12-bit source, that is always going to present a smoother gradation than even the most pristine 10-bit source. And I need to stress that again, this comparison and whatever conclusions we can draw from this demonstration is that the conclusions only apply on the 2017 LG OLED, and I still probably need to actually see how much of an improvement Dolby Vision will be over HDR10 on, let's say, a competent LED LCD that can exceed 1000 nits, such as the Sony ZD9, or in the States it's called a Z9D. But it is going to be extremely unlikely for me to be able to get one Sony ZD9 into this room again, let alone two 65-inch ZD9. So I don't think I'll be able to make the comparison in the near future. Obviously, if money was no object, if I don't have any budget restraints, I'll just go out and buy 200-inch Sony ZD9 to do side-by-side comparison once the Dolby Vision firmware update arrives for the Sony TVs with X1 Extreme chipsets. I'll be going out and just splash 100 grand on two Sony 100-inch ZD9, one displaying Dolby Vision from an OPPO 203 Blu-ray player, the other one displaying HDR10 from Panasonic UB900. But yes, Dolby Vision is better than HDR10 on the 2017 LG OLEDs. If you have enjoyed this video, please click the like button and subscribe to the HDTV Test YouTube channel for more videos like this. These types of in-depth comparison videos take an insane amount of preparation, planning, time, effort, and some luck to put together. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you the next time.